So welcome everybody. My name is Rabbi Mark Katz. I'm the rabbi here at Temple Near Tamid, for those who I haven't met. And I am just really excited to have this conversation. I'm going to introduce our two panelists in a second, and I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then you're going to see me a little bit later because I'm going to engage in some of the conversation tonight. But before I begin, just a few thank yous and then an important message. So first, I want to thank Shirley Colbert, who's a member of our congregation, who sponsored tonight in memory of her husband, Mac. And I want to thank Carrie Shavat, who really has made this series happen. We do this from time to time. Our next one is actually at the end of March with Representative Josh Gottheimer. And we have distinguished civic servants come to the congregation to speak about any number of important issues. And tonight, we couldn't pick a more timely issue than talking about anti-Semitism. So you don't need to be told what you already know if you're sitting in this room, which is that anti-Semitism is on the rise. It's something that we observe both on the micro and on the macro level. And it's something that needs to be addressed in any number of ways. Of course, locally, it's education, it's arming our children with facts, it's helping make sure that local leaders like me speak out when we hear what's going on, and we develop the right relationships with the schools and with the local police departments and any number of other places where we can help make a difference. But it also matters on the policy level. And what goes on in Washington, not only the tone and timbre of what goes on in Washington ends up trickling down to us, but also the decisions that are made, what gets said on the floor, what bills get passed, what funding gets passed, is a really important barometer and has an important effect on anti-Semitism here and all over our country. And so we couldn't be more pleased to have Representative Mikie Sherrill here to talk about this very issue. And before I introduce her, I just want to say a caveat. I know that not everybody is going to agree with everything that Representative Sherrill says. In fact, I don't always agree with Representative Sherrill, but she and I have a really wonderful dialogue and a really great relationship. What we're going to ask is if there is something that you hear that you don't agree, that of course she's going to stick around for a few minutes. You can come speak to her after. You can always come speak to me. If you don't have her information, you can send it to me. I will send it to her office, which will get that to her. What I will ask is that nobody stands up and says their opinion while she is speaking. I want to make a note that we're in a different place than, let's say, a town hall that she would be speaking in. We're in a sanctuary, which is not a place of protest. It is a place of respectful disagreement, which means you hold on to that disagreement until after, and then we'll find a way to channel that disagreement for you. But I really want to say, with as much passion as I possibly can, that as important as this agreement is, tonight is a night for listening. Are we all in agreement? Yes. Thank you. Yes. So now for our introductions. So first, I'm going to introduce Jim Axelrod. Jim is from CBS News. He has been covering many issues over the course of his career, and I've heard him up here probably at this point a half dozen times in my tenure at the congregation. And every time he's here, he brings his thoughtfulness, his empathy, his warmth, and his insight to this job. And so if you want to see his work, go on YouTube. But if you want to see him masterfully navigate a bima, just stay tuned. Representative Mikie Sherrill has been the representative of this district basically as long as I've lived here. You started right when I started, like almost 6 or 7 years ago. And I found that she is one of the most articulate people in politics right now about any number of issues, but especially around Israel and anti-Semitism. And I find that when she comes to this issue, she brings to it so much integrity and so much thought. You should know, by the way, that when Representative Sherrill has to make a hard decision, she doesn't do it in a vacuum. Not only does she listen to the congregants to the constituents, you can see the hat that I always wear, the constituents that come to her with their own concerns and listen to them, but she also seeks out advice, and she and I have actually talked any number of times before her hard votes that she's about to take, and I have no doubt that it's not just me, it's who she is. It's someone who consistently seeks more information, to grow, to learn, and inevitably understands the weight of her job, which is on her shoulders. So without further ado, we'll welcome our two speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. And thank you. It is so wonderful. I'm actually realizing this is going to work.
Okay, I'm just copying you,
There you
you're
go.
the expert.
That usually doesn't lead anywhere good for people, but I think in this case. So it is really wonderful to have you here, and we are deeply grateful that you would take some time out of what I know is an overwhelmingly busy schedule to address this topic that is causing such examination, but such pain, such fear, caution, lots of things. Math is not my strong suit, but I have my little calendar out today, and I started counting. It's been 128 days since October 7th. And for so many of us in this room tonight, those 128 days have been filled with just an awful broad range of emotions. We've had confusion, we've had frustration, we've had a reacquaintance with some perilous dynamics and realities that we may have naively thought we'd never encounter again, especially not with the pervasiveness and the intensity that we have seen in the past 4 months. So I think the way of starting, I would just like to ask you for some broad thoughts about what you feel has transpired in the last 128 days, both in the region and then here in our community with anti-Semitism.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me here to speak about this. It really is, I think, such an important topic to people throughout our district, throughout our country. And wow, it's hard. I think we're all still continuing every day to process this anew with new information that comes up every day. And I just keep thinking back to about a year ago, as I was thinking about coming here, when I was here and we were talking about the attack on Near to Me with the Molotov cocktail. And we sat here and people representing just about every faith community, every interest community in here, Rabbi Katz invited them here to come together when the community was hurting. And that felt like such a special evening. And to arrive here feels bewildering when we're so divided. To sit here in the aftermath of October 7th and see anti-Semitism, the likes of which I never thought I'd see in my lifetime in the United States. And make no mistake, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism for years now. We saw the attack on Near to Me. I've called out different elected officials for some different things they've said over the years. I've sat with the ADL, I've sat with roundtables, I've heard from students about specific instances on their college campuses. But I think what we're seeing now, while maybe having its roots in some of those places and at some of those times, feels so much worse. Friends whose child is in a chat room where they're called a dirty Jew, and where someone is wearing a Hitler mustache. They said you were going to cry.
Gotcha.
I thought you were going to be the one.
Sometimes it's infectious.
See it coming, but when I think
Glad it was you first. Just hang on.
When I think about our children, and when I think about the world I thought they were growing up in, and when I think about that day when I thought we were so together a year ago, and I think about where we are today, it feels bewildering. So I wish I could tell you where we were today. I still haven't finished processing it. I kind of think about it all the time and how we can address it and how we can do better. But what I can tell you is where I think we need to go. I think we need to make sure that this instance, that what we're all feeling now is not the end of it. We have to find a way forward, and it feels like very dark times. They often call democracy this great experiment we call democracy. It feels like right now this idea that we can all live together, that we can all practice our religion freely, that we can have this diverse group of people, that we can have faith in our neighbors, that we can all have so much faith in our neighbors that we're going to rely on them to elect our public officials that govern us all. It feels like it's imperiled. And it feels like the anti-Semitism we're seeing and feeling is one aspect of this, what I would call sickness in our society. And we can't let it end here. We can't give up here. We can't withdraw into our own communities, keep other people out, just worry about what it is that our family and our close friends need. We can't give in to that right now, because then we just admit defeat.
I just want to tell you how powerful it is, certainly for me, but I assume for a lot of people in this room. We've all retreated into a bubble. It feels safer somehow, because I'm not sure a lot of Jews feel that people understand. To have our representative move to tears about what is happening is enormously moving, but it provides a certain sense of security. So I want to thank you for being so moved.
Well, that's really nice of you. But I don't think people who are not Jewish can truly and deeply understand it as people who are Jewish. But I do think, and I will share, that I think we're all feeling very threatened. So certainly it's different for me and how I think of my children and how I think of them going to college and what the threats might be to them and the world I want them to grow up in, versus maybe how my Jewish friends are feeling right now. But it is just so horrible to think that the world I thought I was creating for our children is not at all what I thought it was. And I would just encourage people to give those of us who maybe don't always understand what you're feeling some grace and reach out, because I think we're better than this as a nation. We're better than what we're seeing right now. And I think to the extent we can all try to bring people together and maybe have some empathy for people, and I just say that because it's really hard.
100%.
You know, when people are attacking you, when they're attacking your children, your first instinct isn't to say, sit down, let's have a cup of coffee. This is what's wrong with what you're doing right now, and this is why it's hurting me, and this is why it's hurting my kids, and this is why it's hurting my family, and maybe give them some space to rethink their actions.
So much of what's going on, there's almost this sort of twin tracks. You have this spiking anti-Semitism that I do want to circle back to, but it's all unfolding in a way it's been crystallized by the events of the last 4 months, because for many people who are critical of Israel and not familiar or living with or next to or in neighborhoods with Jews, it becomes the fuel. So I want to just make sure I understand and the room understands where your positions are on the war. Public statement that I saw you made last November. Israel has a right to defend its citizens after the terror attacks by Hamas. In turn, the war has become an ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza that has threatened access to food, water, medical relief, safe havens, and the lives of Palestinian civilians. You quote the Secretary of State as saying, "We don't have to choose between defending Israel and aiding Palestinian civilians. We can and must do both." How?
That is certainly the question. And I think that's what we're facing right now. And I'll tell you that the way I think that Netanyahu is going about it is not the pathway forward. And I've expressed this to members of his government, to members of the IDF, because many of us come at this from our experience in the global war on terrorism. And I think that's why we feel so strongly about this, because we, after 9/11, decided that we were going to have, as the name suggests, a global war on terrorism. I would tell you, I think there are more people who have been activated against the United States in the wake of our 20 years of war than there were prior to the war. I would suggest we did not win that war, certainly as we are trying now to gather allies in the Middle East to prevent a regional war and to come up with a better path forward for Israel and the Palestinians. I think we are seeing our sort of weakness in the area after 20 years of war. It's simply not led us to a safer, stronger, more secure, better position. And so I've expressed that. I feel incredibly strongly that you can't simply have a war to eradicate Hamas. That is not a military strategy. In fact, I would suggest that right now, what Israel has done is consolidate more support behind Hamas in the region than there was prior to the war. And that we are seeing signs of radicalization. And I think we can, we have something, it's called insurgency math that the military will talk about, and you can't create more insurgents than you end. And right now, I think we see a pathway towards creating a lot of future members of Hamas if we don't change tactics right now. And I've said this publicly. I've said this in a letter to our government. I've said it to one of the generals leading the IDF right now, who came into my office and told me about came into an office on the Hill and told me all about the military victories he was achieving. And I said, I am sure that there have been generals that sat in this very room telling other members of Congress about all their victories in the global war on terrorism. And again, we lost that war. So we
Hang
really
on.
do
What did
need
he
a
say
better
to you?
strategy.
I'm just curious. How did he answer that?
He said, I don't know if you understand the feelings in Israel right now. And I looked at him and I said, and that's why Israel needs leadership. Because if you have a leader that is not going to lead you to a better place, if you have a leader that is going to continue to stoke some of the flames of this and not look for a better strategy or not enunciate what is the pathway forward and what is the end goal, then you're going to have a population that sort of remains, as I think some people have said to me, I feel like we're just stuck on October 7th.
All right, so let me ask you this, because I know that you've publicly several times calls for humanitarian pauses. And check me if I'm not right here, but I don't think you've called for a ceasefire. What is the difference between a humanitarian pause and a ceasefire, and why would you call for one and not the other?
So sometimes words mean certain particular things, and when you're talking about war, when you're talking about international things, and then sometimes words take on a life of their own, and I think in this case you have both. I did not come out for a ceasefire because I think that Israel does have a right to defend itself. I think a ceasefire, without discussing some of the conditions for that and why that would make sure, why in those conditions we could make sure Israel is secure, would not have led to the path forward. That said, I thought a humanitarian pause was necessary. I was very disappointed that it did not lead to a longer-term pause. We saw that was the greatest number of hostages that were released. I've been very disappointed, and as we were talking about how we were going to get hostages released, and as we had the Secretary of State in the region working on just that, instead Netanyahu chose to move forward on a different path. That I was very happy to see 2 hostages released, but I don't think this is the path that's going to get the majority of hostages or all of them released.
As you began to get your sense of this particular landscape on October 7th, you obviously you have a highly developed context about the region, about the military. Has anything surprised you about Netanyahu? Has your thoughts evolved about him and therefore what should be done from October 7 to now?
So I had been told by many people, including probably several of you in this congregation, that that their sense of Netanyahu was that he was trying to stay out of jail and that he would prolong this war as long as possible, and that was what was driving him. People have suggested that. And yet I will say that despite having heard that several times, I have been incredibly surprised that there is just no desire by Netanyahu or his government to enunciate a better strategy going forward. And in many cases, they have been bleeding public support at certain times, which when you are fighting, I mean, when you're in the United States, if you're fighting a war, you're fighting on several fronts, including the war of public opinion, which is critically important in many cases. So I've been very surprised that that does not seem to be of interest to Netanyahu's administration. I've been very surprised that when you are in the region as the United States and you are working with your traditional allies and you are taking on over 170, I believe at this point, attacks on your own forces in the region, and you are working incredibly hard not to allow this to go into a regional war which is very well understood in Israel, that the United States has been, immediately sends carrier battle group trying to keep tensions lower. That you would then go and undermine the president as the president's working with our allies in the region, trying to do things like come up with some idea of, could we have Saudi Arabia recognize Israel in exchange for different things that would create more stability in the region? Is that the best path forward? And I think that is certainly something that is very compelling. Who's going to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza? Can some of our allies in the region be helpful there? Who's going to take over the security of Gaza? I think certainly eventually we would want it to be self-governing in a two-state solution, but I don't think that right now there is a government that we feel would offer Israel the security it needs. I think the United States and Israel don't, and as I expressed, I think some of my concerns about the US, I think don't necessarily have the credibility. So are there other allies in the region that will help take over the security aspects in the region, along with support from the United States and Israel? And these are really critical issues if we are ever going to get beyond this war, and if we are going to make sure that there is a future where Israel, the next 75 years don't look like the last 75 years. Where is the future for security of Israel? These are really the critical questions. And when you are addressing these, when you have what seem to me to be obvious allies and obvious people who wish you ill in the region. So I would suggest that when you look at how we might line up a future security agreement, it would possibly include countries like the United States, many of our traditional allies across the world, but in the region, the United States, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. On the other side, we're talking, of course, all of the terrorist, Iranian-backed terrorist groups, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, Russia. If we don't fund Ukraine, we'll be back in the region in a really perilous way. So I think these are really critical issues that we need to. I've been surprised that Netanyahu and his administration not only does not want to engage on those issues, but seems to undermine the efforts of the US government in the region to do just that.
In your view, Israel's right to defend itself in the international community, is that seen as different than other countries' rights to defend themselves? Does Israel get judged differently?
I hear this a lot, that there's a sense that Israel gets judged differently, and I think that probably comes from a long history of Israel getting judged differently in the United Nations. However, I would say when it comes to this wartime effort, I mean, certainly Russia has been judged very harshly in Ukraine for some of the actions they've taken that have actually resulted in far fewer casualties than some of the actions that Israel's taking. So I think right now what people are feeling is that there is new access. I think there's a new respect for human life in the world. I think there's new access to videos of what goes on in war, which war is horrible. I think it's something that people have been able to put out of their minds. So I think when you bring the war to citizens, you have a clamor.
All right, so there is a a painful follow-up to this, but it's a necessary question for us to discuss. And I think there's a word that's highly charged, especially to people in this community, that we have all been confronting. I know that parents are fighting with their adult children, siblings, families. They're all divided by wrestling with this concept of genocide. In your view, is Israel committing genocide in Gaza?
No, I've looked at what South Africa was claiming in the International Criminal Court, and I think there are some incredibly problematic statements by the Netanyahu government. But no, I've spoken to people on the ground. I've spoken to IDF soldiers. There does not. I have not seen any evidence that there is a plan to eradicate the Palestinian people. I think there are problems with how this war is being conducted, and I've talked about several of them, and I've put out, concerns I've had about statements by members of the Netanyahu government. But I don't think that as you look at the international definition of genocide, that is being committed here in Gaza.
Before we move to more of a discussion about anti-Semitism here, I just want to ask you to maybe take us behind the curtain a little bit and tell us how it works on Capitol Hill right now. I imagine, yeah.
Or it doesn't work?
No, we got the rest of the night. I imagine that when something like this happens, October 7th, people scurry to their predetermined positions. And I have a little bit of insight into how it works, but maybe you could share. Are you actually having conversations with colleagues where there is a free flow exchange of ideas and the possibility exists that you're going to change somebody's mind? I'm curious. Have you talked to Representative Omar? Have you talked to Representative Tlaib?
So it's interesting you say that, because I think that there are people that who have a certain view, and I don't know that their view is going to change, and so I've not talked to Representative Omar Tlaib on this issue. I assume we're just in a different space on this, and there are people who I'm concerned about their positions on anti-Semitism in the Freedom Caucus, and I've not really gone directly to them. The people I generally speak to are people that I think are thoughtful members who are working hard to get to a better place in the region and actually are going to weigh in important ways. And so, for example, I've been incredibly concerned about some of the supplemental funding. And when the supplemental failed in the Senate, there was a movement by Schumer to strip out the border provisions. And then Senator Murphy, who'd been working on the border provisions, was adamant. I'd spoken to him. He was actually supposed to come brief a small group of us. He was going to come over and explain the border provisions that we were about to vote on. Obviously, that was not what happened. What he came to brief us on was the border, the bill that was failing, and to tell us what happened, which was basically they had all the votes. Trump said, "Kill it by sunrise." He killed it. They all killed it by sunrise. Not one Republican, including Langford, who had negotiated it with Murphy, would vote for it. But anyway, so Murphy was really pushing for some border support in the supplemental. And so I went after that, as Schumer was stripping out the border stuff, I went over to talk to my Republican colleagues to find out if they could vote on a supplemental, and if they would accept some level of border money in the supplemental for our southern border for resources there. So just to give you a sense of sort of, it feels like Alice in Wonderland a couple times. They said, no, not 1 cent for the border, strip it all out. And I said, okay. I looked at them. I mean, these are people I work with. I just said, you do realize how ridiculous that sounds. I mean, you guys have been yelling about support for the border for 6 years now since I've been in Congress. And they were like, we can't pass it. We can't pass 1 cent for the border. I said, all right. So I did take that back to leadership because I know Murphy was pushing it that, so these are the colleagues I talked to try to figure out how, despite the partisanship in Washington, despite people being, very discouraged in different ways on trying to get stuff done, how we are still going to keep moving forward and getting stuff done. And so, we are seeing, we're continuing to push stuff forward. And I think we've seen some movement on the supplemental in the Senate. And I think we're gonna, we have some procedural workarounds to get around the Speaker in the House. So we'll see if we can't do that and keep moving it forward.
But when it comes to a discussion about Israel, about anti-Semitism, about the terrible divisions that exist, I assume you're not really sitting down and, as you say, having a cup of coffee and saying, you ever thought about this? No one's really listening.
I can't say that I have that with some of the colleagues in the House necessarily. I do have those conversations with a lot of people in the district who are really upset about different things and really trying to discuss how this is impacting the district and why this is so important. And we do have some discussions in the House Armed Services Committee about some of the ways we move forward with a more fair military. But again, the House Armed Services Committee is generally, there aren't a lot of extreme. I mean, Matt Gaetz is on it. He's quite extreme.
Moving on.
But not a lot of extremists on that committee.
So let me ask you this, because this was my favorite fact in the preparation for tonight. Tell us a little bit about preschool for you. Where'd you go to preschool?
So I went to a Jewish preschool in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and my first best friend was Allie Hoken. And I think what you're alluding to, because I told you this, so I was raised Catholic, and I had been told that was the first, religion in the Christian faith, and for some reason I took the Christian faith. I didn't really understand that. I was thinking it was like the oldest church. Somehow that was in my mind, and Allie told me that no, Judaism was older, and I said no, that's not true. And we had a big fight about it. And I went home. I told her that, Catholicism was the oldest one. And my mom goes, well, it's not. I mean, Jesus was a Jew. And I was just like, right? I was very, very put out with that information. So yeah, that was my early preschool career. I think some of the first ornaments that I made for our Christmas tree were popsicle stars of David with glitter. So
we have a shoebox full of those somewhere in our basement. So. But did you grow up around Jews? Rabbi Katz talked about this deep love and respect that you exhibited throughout the whole Molotov cocktail incident for the Jewish community. Where does your affinity come from?
So, yes, I've always had neighborhoods where Jewish people were there. I think I also mentioned you, though, largely in my high school, I knew Jewish people, but it wasn't something remarkable. It was just some of my friends were Jewish, some were non-denominational Christians, some were Catholic. I don't even think I could have told you the religions of all of my friends. I probably knew some of the Catholic ones because I'd see them in church, but it wasn't really that noteworthy. And certainly I'm not, I think we've gotten to a point where we want to not say stuff like, oh, I don't see color, right? We want to respect and admire other people's cultures and have an understanding of it, but there really is something very nice about a world where you live in, where each person has their own religion and they practice their religion, and that's accepted and understood, and yet it is sort of, in some ways, not noteworthy. It's just, you're practicing your religion. I've got, you have to go to.
Yep. I miss that world.
Yeah, you have to go to your synagogue on Saturday. And you can't You have to get up early for that on Saturday, so you can't go out late Friday, and I can't go out late Saturday because I have to get up early Sunday.
You guys are allowed to watch all the best cartoons on Saturday.
On Saturday.
I had to go to Hebrew school.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, so.
Let me ask you this. 0.2% of the world's population is Jewish. Where there's 14, 15 million of us in the world. How do you think the Jews got to be Goliath in the view of so many people?
You know, I think it's this sort of ancient scapegoatism in some ways. I think we see it in Nazi Germany and even before that. I think you also, I think right now you're also just seeing kind of what I think of as sort of the oldest autocratic populist type trick in the book of finding a scapegoat and finding someone. And I think as we're in a time in our country where people are trying to find villains all the time, I think that October 7th somehow presented this villain. I'll just be honest, I really think that right now and in today, I think social media has a lot to do with it. I am a firm believer that we need to have a forced sale of TikTok. I think that is a platform that is run by the Chinese Communist Party, and I think it is just putting a bunch of propaganda on, subjects that the party wants to put into the brains of a lot of our children. And I think that you can see that, and we don't have the algorithms because it is, it's something that the government protects, the government of China. But I would say that if you look at some of the numbers of pro-Palestinian views versus pro-Israel views, it's very skewed. I think that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't allow, I've been told I'm not on TikTok personally, and I've told my kids not to be on TikTok, and they're not supposed to be, and we have some backsliding occasionally. It's my understanding that you can't really criticize, for example, China on TikTok or the Communist Party. So I think that they control what is often put out on that, and I think that this is really dividing our community. I think that's problematic. Certainly, we've seen other attempts with bots and stuff. For example, I have a social media platforms that I communicate on. And whenever I communicate on Ukraine, I get tons of attacks. And I assume those are Russian bots. So I just think there are certain things going on in those platforms that are very concerning, and certainly the anti-Semitism on TikTok, I think, is one of them.
Rabbi, can you come on up? I just want Rabbi Katz to join the conversation as well as we sort of turn towards this exploration and examination of anti-Semitism in our own backyard. Just, let me start out by just asking you your sense of why it's been spiking and what your fear level is.
So I think part of the reason that it's been spiking as much as it has is, I think, social media is a big piece of it. I think that 2016 emboldened people who wouldn't normally be emboldened. I also think that there's a general trend in the United States toward loneliness. And I know that seems like it shouldn't have anything to do with it, but what happens is that people need to seek out like-minded people. And as you're looking at that, there becomes kind of almost tribes, right? And whatever those tribes believe, even the most radical view, the more kind of tribalness the tribe is, the more you feel a part of something. And often hate and distrust and a non-willingness to engage with people other than you is the thing that defines that tribe. I'll also say that anti-Semitism has often been caused, or anti-Semitism displays itself as the thing for which your society fears, right? So it's really odd that in communist Russia, Jews were called capitalists, And in 1930s America, Jews were called communists. And so if you look, there are these big fears, both on the right and on the left, right? What does the right hate the most? It hates immigrants coming in, taking their jobs, changing America, right? The extreme right. So what do Jews get blamed for? They get blamed for facilitating the Great Replacement theory, right? The Jews are trying to change the demographics and replace the whites in America. What does the left hate the most? It hates globalized, I'm blanking on the word right now. Help me out.
In a globalized one
No,
world economy?
When a white group comes in, and thank you, they hate colonialism, right? They hate lack of diversity. They hate a tribe that is not open to everybody else, right? And so what do? They put that on the Jews, and that's why Jews are called colonialists and apartheidists, and they hate racism. So what do they call Jews? They call Jews racists. And so I do think that has a tremendous amount to do with the reason that anti-Semitism is rising.
I remember during the pandemic how everybody became an epidemiologist, and then after January 6th, everybody was a constitutional scholar, and now everybody's a historian of the Middle East. And it's troubling because you have conversations dominated by people who aren't really educated in the field. I've got a question for both of you, though, as we're talking about fear, and I don't want to root it in history. I think every day since October 7th, I've thought of my grandparents. And what I think I'd love to say to them is, now I get it. Because they used to talk about, my grandfather had a picture of his mother's family, half of whom never got out of Riga. And I understood they had all lived through the war, and so they had these reflections. But I was growing up in 1970s New Jersey. I was assimilated. There was no worry, no cause for concern. And now I can't say the same thing for my kids. So I want to ask both of you, how real is the fear that it could happen again, and it could happen again here? Is this like overly, I can hear my daughter yelling, don't be dramatic. Am I being dramatic, or is it a real fear?
So I never thought I'd be living through these times. I never understood what happened in Nazi Germany. I remember, especially when the wall fell, you would hear these like uprisings of skinheads in Eastern Germany and sort of Nazism and swastikas. And I remember thinking, what's wrong over there, right? Oh, how does that happen? And just not even thinking that it could happen here. And now you say people have been a scholar of the Middle East. I've been sort of a scholar of 1930s Germany. It feels like we are on the brink, and it feels very scary. And I have people that say to me, and I bet some of you have said it too, because I've probably said it too to my mom or something, but if Trump wins again, I'm moving. I'm going overseas. I'm going here. I actually had one woman tell me she was going to go to Poland, and I said, I don't think you want to go there. But if democracy falls here, nowhere is safe. I mean, we are the country that has supported democracy for decades, and I can tell you, just in dealing with NATO, I always tell people when we worked with NATO, I've worked with NATO for years, and I'm the oldest of 3 girls, and I always said, our work with NATO is like being the big sister. You're always like, look, you guys got to pay 2%. You got to pay for your defense. And if you don't, I'm telling, right? I'm telling, you're going to have to pay. And why aren't you here? And why aren't you coming to this exercise? And we told you guys about this exercise. You only sent one ship. You're supposed to send 5 ships. Like, come on, get it with it. And you could always feel this sense of like, oh my gosh, them again.
So what did you think the other night?
And yet I thought it was crazy. And I tell you now, when we left, there was never a bigger sense of palpable relief with NATO than when Biden got into the presidency, and then when Russia was about to attack and the US was willing to lead in the efforts to stop that. And so I can tell you that walking away from our NATO allies, as Trump says he wants to do, suggesting that he's going to support Putin in anything, I mean, this is all the brinksmanship that we are on. This is what's at stake here. And this is why I have to tell you that all of this is a house of cards if the United States falls in our efforts in democracy. And that's why we can all feel scared. Many of us do. I feel scared sometimes. I worry about my children. My daughter wants to go into the military. I've cautioned her. I'm not sure what that looks like if Trump wins the presidency. And if he might even attack you personally because of my statements against him. We're all scared right now, but we can't give in to that. We can't just kind of walk away from this country that has been so great, that did provide you that sense of security in the 1970s. We can't fail. We can't have what our grandparents did and the sacrifices that they made. My grandfather was shot down in World War II, and when I looked at how many of the B-24 planes that he flew actually completed their mission and didn't crash or get shot down, I mean, the numbers were amazing to me. I never quite understood that. How many people died on D-Day? I went over to Normandy, and there were 18 and 17, and some of them lied and were 16 years old. We can't give up on that sacrifice that they've made in the world they created, and we have to deliver that for our kids. And so I think we're right to be afraid. I think we're right to be doing, everything we can because it's a very real threat. But I think we just have to, in our heart of hearts and deep within us, know that we are going to be able to prevail, that we are going to be able to deliver for our kids what we had when we were growing up, because anything else is just unacceptable. We can't allow that to happen.
So I'm going to take a different tact, which is that I'm actually not so concerned that the next Nazi Germany is going to be in America. I'm concerned there will be a lot more Pittsburgh shootings in America. And I'm concerned that, our kids are going to go to school and see swastikas written on desks and called names in the playground, log online and hear taunts, get into gaming, which is one of the most dangerous places for anti-Semitism, and just hear horrible things said in the gaming world, the online gaming world.
So it's not the games, it's just when people are the chat?
Exactly. It's that you play with strangers, you inhibit characters in these games, and people talk to each other and people say horrible things. I'm concerned with all of that. I'm not necessarily concerned that this is going to be the next Nazi Germany. Now, things could, of course, change, but what I find is the difference between Nazi Germany and now is that Nazi Germany was state-sponsored terror. So it was not the radicals and the outliers, right? Those are the people who will go and fire on a synagogue. It was the state itself making decisions that inevitably caused the Jews to die. And from what I've seen from, elected officials like you, Representative Sherrill, I feel like there are many more allies than there are people willing to abandon us.
Can I respond to that
Please.
really quickly? Yeah. Because I think there are many more allies, and yet the power of the far right has really started to scare me. So I've been really frustrated. I serve on a bipartisan group of veterans, and especially after January 6th, I almost quit the group. I was furious. And afterwards, we had a family discussion, and I'm yelling at them about their, lack of response or what they're doing. And I heard a lot of, well, you don't know my base, or you don't know this. And I was really frustrated. And with some of the people, I just really felt like they should have, that was a moment they could have come out and been so powerful. And I don't know, obviously the people largely that came out for impeachment in the Republican Party are no longer in Congress, so I'm not sure how many it would have taken, but I do think that was a moment. If we had acted differently, we might be in a bit different space. But I'll tell you now, I don't think anyone has the capacity to do that in the Republican Party. I think it's been so consolidated. So I work with Mike Gallagher, he's a veteran, and he's the chair of the China Committee on which I serve. And he committed to me when I was getting on it. I said, I'm not going to get into some partisan battle over who's tougher on China. I'm like, I really, I want to do real work in Congress. And he committed to me that that would be that kind of place. And it has been. He's done, a great job. General Petraeus said to me, Mike Gallagher is a national treasure. And I said, yeah, sure, I guess. So Mike Gallagher, who I didn't always think stood up and had made a calculation that he could either be in Congress and work from the inside in the Republican Party, or he could take a stand, the other day took a stand. He said on Thursday that it was unconstitutional to impeach Mayorkas. Now, Mike Gallagher has pretty much voted party line like 90% of the time or more. But on that moment, he finally said, no, this is unconstitutional. And that was Thursday, and by this weekend, Mike Gallagher announced his retirement from Congress. I don't think in the Republican Party there is any person that can now stand against the juggernaut that Trump has created. I think that if we defeat Trump in November, we might see a different path forward. I'm hoping 3 strikes and you're out. But I do think right now it's in a very dangerous place.
I want to cover one more area, and I know we're running out of time. I do want to hit this before we go.
I will agree with the rabbi. I do still think it's not a majority of people. It's just a consolidation by a minority.
And I want to throw out one piece of historical context, and that is that Adolf Hitler first hit the national stage in Germany in 1920, and he was thrown off the national stage 1920. So I would love to be not wigged out, and that would be making for many more comfortable nights of sleep. But how do we know what 12, 15, 20 years from now holds unless we are vigilant? Let me just cover one more area, because you wrote this letter to New Jersey college presidents in which you were seeking to make some points about campus anti-Semitism. Can you just give us the couple-minute version of that? Because I do think it's an important issue for us to try to get our arms around.
So, in 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. I have like 3 years of thoughts on this, but okay. So people first started coming to me with concerns about anti-Semitism on colleges several years ago, but it was very discrete instances. It was an art exhibit that had anti-Semitic things in it that the college shouldn't have promoted. It was certain statements that people had made or college professors had made. I did not understand it to be a systemic issue until after October 7th, and then we have members of our community who have been on college campuses who have talked about, and you sort of referenced it, Rabbi, the decolonization, Marxist education that's going on. And I think several things. I think, first of all, we are not doing good enough by our students in civics education, because these are the top colleges and universities in the country. So we should have our top students able to go to these colleges, and no matter what is being taught, to some extent, able to muster a strong defense of democracy and our system of government. And they seem unable to have done that, and they seem to be, co-opted or shouted down in some way. We certainly, I think, need to address what is being taught on a colleges. I think you can teach Marxism. I think you can teach communism and socialism, but you have to, I think, have a balanced approach. Traditionally, in our college campuses, you would have some very conservative thought leaders and very liberal thought leaders. I certainly think having the whole political philosophy group, a bunch of people, well-versed in Marxist decolonization thought is hugely problematic. And I think it has led to anti-Semitism. I think it's led to anti-Western thought, anti-democracy, democratic thoughts, a true misunderstanding as well, which concerns me about our top colleges, that some of the very things that allow certain people to have these protests and be out in the common spaces are things that were awarded to them because of our democratic form of government, and in many places across the world, they'd be thrown in jail. I think that the issue I hear all the time from the community and the frustration is a lack of understanding that in many places across the world, LGBTQ people have no rights, certainly women have no rights. I've served in places where you can be married off when you're 13 to an older gentleman with several wives after having very little schooling. I don't know that there's an understanding, and these are, might I remind you, our top colleges and universities. So of all places, there should be an understanding of the world, an ability to converse on that and what the concerns are, but also what the gifts of democracy are and why it's different. Why, as we talk on the, there's the committee to compete with Chinese Communist Party. One of the key things here is nobody wants to go to China. Right? People are coming here. There's a reason for that. And it's often the freedoms that we offer. So I think that what we're seeing going on here is really concerning. And then when you have college professors or college presidents who come before Congress, and nobody is asking them to come before Congress because they are good lawyers and can give you technical explanations. They're asking you to come before Congress because the community is scared and concerned and seeing things that are concerning, and they could not explain how they are ensuring that Jewish students are made to feel welcome, or that some of the concerns we have on our college campuses are being thoughtfully addressed. And when you find yourself as a member of Congress having to grudgingly agree with some of the questions from Elise Stefanik, something's wrong. So in the aftermath of that, I sent letters out to our own colleges and universities here in New Jersey. And I got back some incredibly thoughtful, detailed ways in which our colleges and universities want to make sure that they are doing better than many colleges across the nations. We're still having those conversations. I just had the independent colleges and universities in my office, and one of the first questions I asked of them was, how are you ensuring that students feel welcome, that students feel able to converse? And I got Seton Hall University actually had a really thoughtful answer about how much work they're doing, because they're a very small school, on an individual basis with each student to talk to them about how they're feeling. Not every school can do that, but this is a constant thing. And I have found when you are a member of Congress and when people are coming to lobby you and you ask these questions, people realize that in order for you to support them in their endeavors, that you are going to expect them to uphold some of the values that you think are important. So whether it's, asking some of your chemical companies what they're doing for the environment, which they have some very good answers now, or talking to your schools and universities that desperately need a better financial path forward about what they're doing to support all of their students, it can be a very powerful tool.
So I know we're close to out of time. I just want to let Rabbi Katz have a final word here.
Yeah, so I want to say something about the colleges, which is, I think there's a few factors. The first is that it's not just the curriculum, it's that colleges and universities don't teach people how to disagree anymore, which I guess you're saying, but in a slightly different way. That the disagreement can be, and in Judaism it's true, it can be a sacred thing, and people feel very threatened by it. The idea that any space where someone disagrees with you is inherently non-safe is not necessarily true. The second thing also is the lack of ability to let Jews define what a Jew is actually incredibly problematic. And Jews are one of the only
minorities in all of America where people push back on them when they try to define themselves, right? Almost always when you walk into leftist space, any group that is in the left space will get ceded the ability to say, this is what it means to be gay. This is what it means to be Black, right? That's part of what that's part of what DEI training is kind of letting the other person lead. What I actually find is that Jews have to fight tooth and nail for that. And Judaism is really confusing to people who are not Jewish, right? We're a religion, but we're not like a religion like Christianity, because we're also a culture with a national identity. And then there's a sense of family somehow, like every Jew is a second cousin of one another, and you treat each other like that, even if you're not actually related. And so it would take an hour for a Jew to explain what their relationship to Judaism is, and then inherently what their relationship of that Judaism is to Israel. And so I'm finding also that there's a kind of a blending of Israel and Jew together into one in a place where the universities haven't actually given the space for Jews to define what Jewishness is. And that's the reason, for example, that, at Rutgers, I remember talking to our attorney general about this, there were like major protests on Shabbat outside of a Chabad house. Chabad wasn't a political organization. Yes, they were giving underage drinking to kids, but like that's the worst thing that happens at a Chabad house, And so the truth is, finding the right avenues to disagree with Israel is actually very difficult to learn what that is if you're not Jewish, but not letting Jews lead to tell you where those kinds of disagreements are acceptable ends up unwittingly putting kids in anti-Semitic positions, like protesting at a Shabbat outside of a Chabad house.
So I'm in the position that if I ask you another question, your staff is going to jump on me and rip the microphone out of my hands, because I know we promised you would have been out of here 10 minutes ago. So I can't ask about congestion pricing. But I'm going to run the risk of a bad reaction from your staff, and I am going to ask you, are you going to run for governor?
Thank you, Noah. Thank you. Well, thank you. As you know, right now I'm running for Congress.
I know that. But that's not what I asked
24,
you.
and that is flattering, and I've been asked that. But I really do think for the near term, and I'll certainly give thought to that, but for the near term, I think really being focused on flipping the House of Representatives in these tough times is really critically important.
Let me ask it in a slightly different way. When you are governor, will you come back here for your first major conversation?
I will always be happy to come back.
There you go. That's a commitment.
Thank you.
I do.
Can I just say one before we wrap up? I do just have to tell all of you what a special place this is, and I think you know it, but I do have to really thank Rabbi Katz. He is right. We don't always disagree, and these are some really emotional, tough times, and they have really, I think, strained a lot of us to try to figure out the best path forward when there are so many issues at stake. Most importantly, the trauma that many people in our community are going through. And I do call upon him and really value so much. I so value your counsel that I have even said to somebody as I was walking into a meeting, I said, sorry, I'm late. I'm not Jewish, but I had to talk to my rabbi. So I really do value it, and it is wonderful, and you all are very blessed. So thank you very much, and thanks for having me tonight.
So and one more thank you for
Jim
Representative
Asarad.
Mikie Sherrill. Please.
Thank you to Representative
I got the
Sherrill.
easy job. Thank you.
Thank you again to Shirley Colbert for sponsoring tonight, for Kerry Shabbat for all of his work in making this happen, to Jill Hirsch, who's a member of our congregation, who just is amazing and also helped set this up, to Jonathan Hirsch, no relation, who's our head of security, as well as Josh Katz, who was here before, Marty Baum, our president, and Michelle W. Malkin, who is here, our executive director. Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate it.